It is a distinct pleasure for me to get to introduce Dan Bernstein to those of you who don't know him, who today is wearing the hat as director of KU's Center for Teaching Excellence. And a little bit of background, when we first started talking about a business honors program, the very first stop I made was in Dan's office. And from that meeting, it influenced everything we did when we designed the honors program. He has insights about the science, about the research on the way high-achieving students learn. And as it turns out, so do I. So when Dean Neely asked me to set up a task force to look at the requirements for the business degrees, the first stop I made was in Dan's office. And I pointed out to him that I know how students learn. And the reason I know this, that this book, Chris probably is unfamiliar with, The Theory of Capital Markets by Jan Mosine. When I was a graduate student at Texas, I memorized this book. I learned every proof in this book simply because I then knew more about asset pricing than any of the faculty members, and they didn't have a choice but to give me a degree. And the way I memorized this book was simply by following the author's advice in the preface. This is just classic. So far as studying mathematical economics is concerned, I am a firm believer in the straight wooden chair and the pad and pencil beside the book. All derivations should be retraced in detail, and nothing the author says, such as, quote, "it is easily verified that," should be taken at face value. Isn't that terrific? So far as studying finance is concerned, I'm a firm believer in the straight wooden chair and the pad and pencil beside the book. So I took this passage up to Dan and said, I'm having difficulty getting students to learn this way, and I'm a little concerned that I'm getting old. And then he looked at my bookmark and he said, you are really old, and anybody in here who's laughing is really old. And he was such a gentleman about it. He said, Bill, this straight wooden chair and pad of paper by the book is the way about 15% of the students at KU learn. And they're the students who are going to replace us as the faculty at KU. And this is almost a direct quote. It said, but if you want the students who are actually in the room to learn, you're going to have to change your ways. You're going to have to do things differently. So I'll summarize the research for me, show me some of the directions, which he did. And we settled on this topic, learning from the inside out. That this, you just gave me a very brief summary, but said, this is something that I think would inform a large audience, and would you come down to Summerfield and describe the research? And so that's why it's here. And so, Dan, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Summerfield Hall.
Pleasure is mutual. Thank you. It's always a delight to have a chance to chat with colleagues about these kind of topics. And it is my hope that this will not be a soliloquy, that you'll ask questions, raise issues at any point, and I will try to be sufficiently brief that we'll have time for questions even beyond that. When I moved to KU from the University of Nebraska in 2002, I finally recycled my boxes of punch cards. I had all the algol programs I'd written to analyze my data and boxes and boxes of the raw data. This was a hard thing to do, but I managed. So there are two main ideas I want to promote. Focusing on the qualities of students, but I recently had an occasion to explore some new topics. My interest professionally has been in the educational environment. What we need to do is start where our students are, rather than where we want them to be, or more particularly where we were as students at an earlier age. And after you figure out where your students are, then design activities that meet them at least part way, that are within their range of interest. Our jargony term I borrow from anthropology is experience near learning. So I teach sort of inductively, beginning with things that I think will engage our young colleagues. And then I work toward a more mature and intellectual understanding. When I taught years ago, I would start with the theory and then work toward examples, and now I do that in exactly the opposite direction. Now, where did the things I'm going to show you come from? I was asked to do some workshops, this was at the National University of Singapore, on what we know about our students. What are the things that we think are important about them? And how do we design instruction to meet them? I did 2 workshops, 3 hours each with about 30 faculty members from, largely speaking, the English-speaking university world. Many from Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, North America, some from China, some from Japan, a few from Europe. And we spent the 3 hours together sorting out this topic. And I had everybody write on little sticky notes what they thought of as some of the key characteristics of their students. And this was so techniquey, it almost made me barf. But it turns out it's a technique for a reason. We put these things all over the board, and then people spent time going up and putting them in clusters. And then once we got them in clusters, we unpacked them and talked, well, you know, how do we summarize this? And I did that independently in these 2 3-hour workshops. And then I integrated the results of those clusters and came up with this sort of schema that I'm going to share with you.
Are you doing this in real time?
Well, the workshops were on 2 consecutive days, and then 2 days later I did the final plenary for this conference.
Did we used to call this factor analysis?
It could have been done with factor analysis. I did it with the old interocular test. That looks like a cluster to me. In fancy social psychology, we call this a Q-sort technique, and it's a clunkier version, but it's intended to do the work that a good factor analysis would do. I'm a little behind the times since I still remember what punch cards are. I don't know what structural equation modeling is, but all my young colleagues do that all the time, and they tell me it has some of the same features. So I came up with this list. A key point was mostly when we are a pretty senior bunch in this room, except for our friends who are working the cameras, we talk about today's students as liabilities. And what's wrong with these kids? They don't have any attention span. They're all they want to know is what their grade's going to be. It's all liabilities. I want you to also think of these as assets. That there are features of what we as colleagues now describe our students that are positive, and also remember that these are not all new. That our students are from the same species we are, and though we as a class, future faculty are different from their fellow colleagues as students, we're still more similar than we're different. So I wish not to pathologize our students in any of these characterizations, and I will occasionally reflect on that. First thing that comes up always is affinity for technology. Now note, I did not say tech savvy. Students love working in simple, already well-constructed technology sites, but they are not people who are good at solving problems around technology or with technology. They're adept at and comfortable in being online. There's a big difference there. There's a preference, in some cases, for mediated communication. I have a dear friend who is a Division I volleyball coach, and he's been hammering on his team recently, albeit on email, that they need to develop more face-to-face relationships, that they're too busy knowing their teammates through Twitter and Facebook. And his argument is there's a need for real knowledge of each other as people. They love using established programs. So if you want to use technology as a space for some of your learning, you'll find your students will go there easily. But don't expect them to be creative or to be able to design new things. You need to make it clear how you're doing it, so they're comfortable, though not particularly savvy. There is a lot of connection, though as my friend John says, it is sometimes superficial connection. It is a different connection from the traditional sense of friendship, but frequent contact through social media. There's more socializing in large groups. When I was that age, I thought of a date as, I would go somewhere with one person. My children, when they were teenagers and young adults, they often went out in groups of 6 or 8 and thought that that was a normal date. And there is a very enlarged sense of socialization, and that relationships with people continue at a distance and over a longer time. I grew up in New Jersey. I went to school in California. When I called my parents, it was $3 a minute, and that was $1965. It would be like $20 now. Everybody can communicate with everybody they knew in 8th grade at no cost, because everybody's got a text plan that's 1,000 texts a week. So they are continuing these relationships, connected with others. We tend to perceive our students as highly task-oriented, focused on outcomes like grades, and people particularly want things done efficiently. Don't give me busy work, don't give me a lot of drill and extra stuff. Tell me what I need to know and I'll do it. Now, we sometimes think of that as a negative, as a liability. Why don't they want to read the great books and think the big thoughts and explore these ideas off on themselves, sitting in that chair with that pad of paper taking notes? I would argue most people are very task-oriented, and very few people enjoy being given an open-ended assignment and being allowed or encouraged to find their own way. In my role, working in the Center for Teaching, it is often my job to say to a colleague, here's something new and interesting you could do in your teaching. Here's a way in which you could reach out to your students, or here's a way you could design more authentic assignments. And the most common answer I get when I make that proposition is, will this be on the test? Will this get me tenure? Will my chair give me extra merit for this? And so, and they say, I'm kind of busy, I've got papers to get out, I've got another grant that's due, I'm going to pay attention to the important immediate deadlines, don't give me stuff to do that's not necessary. And I don't pathologize my colleagues when they say that. I understand that job. I've been in that job for a long time. So while this is true of our students, it's true of ourselves as well. We all have priorities, and things at the top of the queue get done, and the other stuff you do quickly. It's also can be an asset, because if you give people a task and you're clear about it, it often gets done. And so I am much more structured in the way I teach than I used to be. Here's what I want you to do, here's when I want it done, here's what you get for it. There is a preference to do things that are meaningful. Again, a lot of what you learn in certain fields comes from repetition, that you need to do the same kind of task in many, many different ways. There's a lot less patience for that, because it appears to be done just for the sake of being done. Whereas students report that they will do something, they'll work very hard if it's a project that has meaning. KU is well known, actually, as a place very big for student service, that a higher percentage of students here participate in community service and service learning than is typical of an institution of our type. Why do they do that? It's part of the ethos of the place that's a meaningful way to spend time. They don't complain about working in downtown community agencies. That's not a waste of time, that's meaningful. So if we want activities to be done, we need to figure out how to make them matter, how to connect them to something important, to how to make them not just an abstract exercise or drill. To the degree possible, and it's not always possible, we want to see if we can tap into some kind of intrinsic motivation. Very flexible in their attention. Students will tell you at great length that they're great multitaskers, that they can in fact have the TV on and be doing homework and tweeting at the same time, and that there's no deficit in that. I tell them, and I can tell you, that's simply not true. All of the data from cognitive psychology are very clear. What looks like multitasking is very fast serial switching. Anytime you really require true multitasking, performance deteriorates greatly. You can tell them that till you're blue in the face, they don't believe you, so that's not the right strategy. Instead, deal with the fact that they are going to want to be doing a lot of switching. And think of ways to assign tasks, whether that's in class or outside of class, that are short and that change, and so that they are doing a multiple series of shorter things. Your students will choose away from work that is repetitive or linear, so you want to break it up. You want to make it appear to be refreshed and interesting and new frequently. One good thing in this, another asset, is multimodal learning is considered quite natural. People can switch back and forth from text to video to listening to something. They are not stuck. I could go on and on about learning styles, one of those popular psychology topics. All the data that I know, and I did research on this for a while, what are called learning styles at most account for less than 10% of the variability in learning. Learning styles do not prevent someone from learning in a way. They are preferences, not capacities or incapacities. So students may prefer one kind of learning or one mode of learning, but they're quite capable in virtually all. And the smart thing to do is to keep mixing around and change modalities frequently.
Dan, can I ask you technical? The rule of thumb I learned in the executive education industry is that with adult learners, you need to change what you're doing about every 20 minutes. In CODL, they say you need to have modules that are in the 5 to 10 minute range. Is that a maturing of cognitive abilities, or is it a difference in age? Or?
I would be willing to bet that age is not the primary variable, that it's more of an individual difference variable, that you can find older people who switch off after 5 minutes, and you can find young people who will stay focused for 20. What's really going to matter is the content. That I've watched, a 14-year-old focus on a single video game for 30 minutes without blinking. Okay, so the trick is, are you doing things that you intend to be very engaging? I myself try to knock everything off at 15 minutes. When I'm planning a class period, I don't do anything in the same way for more than 15 minutes, and then we switch on to something else. There are people who would go longer, there are people who would have tuned out. So variety of mode and nothing too long. Because when people switch to a new thing, it sort of resets. And it gives them a couple seconds to, reprocess what's happening next, think about their calendar.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
I know this would depend on what you're teaching, but let's suppose that I were a math teacher. Okay? And I'm teaching students calculus or algebra or geometry. And what I'm doing is going through by example and problem solving and proof, more of the same, again and again and again. How would I switch? What do I switch to? How do I teach math differently? And I know that's an extreme, but a lot of what I do as someone who teaches like economics or finance is more like that than discussing what was going on in 19th century France.
Okay. Well, yeah, some topics are easier than others to do this. I think you're absolutely correct. One thing to vary is the degree to which you're starting with an unstructured problem versus starting with a formula. And so you could teach some things where you're having them do for a couple of minutes a repeated drill with a particular computational formula. You could, I have a great slide I sometimes use. It's from the far side, The Devil's Library, and it's a book after book of nothing but story problems. Okay? Mixing in story problems drives people crazy. It also engages. You could have people working alone on things and then have them working together in teams. There are math curricula that are designed that way. There's a big debate in our math department here about teaching calculus, just exactly that. And many people think that the purpose of teaching calculus is so students can do proofs. Other serious full professor colleagues think the purpose is for them to be able to recognize what they know about a very ill-defined problem and bring that knowledge to that problem. So you would vary, that kind of problem solving, working inductively from cases toward a generality. Just keep mixing it up. I was pretty good in math as a kid. I was on my high school math team. We were Jersey Hills Conference champions 3 years running. But I could never learn from a math book. I mean, that was just, I could read it, and I would never be able to do the performances out of that. So for me, there were other avenues. And again, it's sort of this multimodal. Some students do learn well from a math book. Other people learn by seeing examples, and then they generalize from those examples to a more generic abstraction. I've seen math teachers do it. Yeah.
Would you categorize your preferences as learning styles, or?
I would probably pathologize myself and say I just didn't work hard enough at it. I didn't do it long enough. The teacher enabled my inadequate reading by teaching the things in class, and so I never had to learn how to do it. There's also, and this was a long time ago, there was a tendency in math books for the mathematician author to take sort of bigger steps and say it is obvious that. And the smart people can see that leap across two inferential steps in between. Whereas I think there's a lot of work now on what are called adaptive tutorials. And in those tutorials, they don't skip those steps. That's what the big data mining people are doing, is identifying exactly what are the missing pieces and when are the leaps too big, and so half of your learners don't make the jump to the next step, and knowing you need to put a bridge in there. And I'm guessing if books then had been written like adaptive tutorials are now, I would have no problem with it. There's a very visual orientation. Happens to suit me. I like pictures and movies a lot. Using visual material, it works really well. Images, speak loudly, particularly for engaging students. And sometimes communication with images is preferred. Something we should pay attention to. Near-term horizon. They will want to see the results of their work sooner. They will not want to be told, well, do this for 5 years and then you'll see later why it's worth doing. It's very important for the work to appear to mature, to bear fruit in the near term. And the sooner they see the utility, the application, the benefit to them of what you're asking them to do, the better. As I say here, they're not willing to do uninteresting work for long times. Again, I see this among my colleagues. I'm in the business of asking people to do something they're not all that keen on doing, which is taking time away from other important work to develop a perhaps less valued part of their professional lives. And if that doesn't make their course better right away, they're very uninterested in doing it. If I were to say, well, if you keep developing this sort of problem set, in 3 or 4 years you might have a decent set of problems, that's not going to get anybody's attention. So some of that means instead of asking them to take your word for it, you'll write to me 5 years later and say, I really loved your course even though I hated it at the time. Build in those ways in which they see the benefit. Don't consider that a flaw that people want to know in the near term that something is worthwhile. There's a valuing of ethics and justice. There's a lot of talk about, back in the 60s we were all idealistic and doing all, now these kids are just cynical and out for a job and money and everything. There are, again, the service learning, the community orientation, the warming up to sustainability and the environment. These are all characteristics. There are a lot of, you just have to find the right buttons. But you'll find that students see value in social causes and they do think of helping as expected. So out of this couple days of conversation with a lot of wonderful colleagues came this list of these are some of the characteristics of the people in the room with us. And instead of viewing them as a problem because they have a near-term horizon, let's just say, okay, how do you take these characteristics and design a class so that it fits that group a little better? And I want to suggest 4 paths to getting inside our students. One is finding appealing forms of expression, active construction of their understanding, connecting to personal experience rather than staying abstract, and bringing your discipline to the community. I think these are useful. I'm going to quickly describe some examples. I believe they're all KU examples, people here doing the kind of work that I'm talking about. One that's sort of simple, and I know it's not new to you, but worth mentioning, is help students find ways of representing their understanding that are different from sitting in a room and writing an exam for 50 minutes, right? Or even the dreaded group report, where 20 minutes of death by PowerPoint. Ayu Saraswati was a faculty member here. She's unfortunately left and moved to Hawaii. Lawrence, Hawaii. Let me think about that. She was teaching a course in socialization of gender. It was filled with, I found it to be rigorous academic content, sociological studies on identity. But she had her students represent their understanding as their term project in an 8-minute video. So she worked with what was then IDS, now CODL, Center on Online Distance Learning, and had them both construct an intellectual argument and then create it in a format that could be shown to the class. She got this idea from one of our guest speakers at CTE, a guy from Georgetown, who came in and talked about how he had done this in a multi-institutional project. And he showed the results of a study they did. They made a film of 20 students who had produced these digital stories, they called them, and interviewed them about their work. Not one of those students, in talking about his or her work, ever mentioned the professor as the audience. They all saw this work as something they wanted to show to their parents, their friends, the other gay and lesbian students on their campus, the other African American students. It was just mind-blowing to me to think that there were students who were doing something for credit in a class, and it wasn't just what does the professor want and how do I get the most points? Ayu was captured by that, and so she developed this project, and her students were the same. They couldn't wait to show people their classroom project. And she used a rubric that vetted it for its intellectual properties, not its video properties. This takes advantage of their digital affinity because they were very adept at editing the digital video, mixing in the sound, finding images. It was a visual representation that was more intuitively appealing. And most importantly, their peers were an authentic audience for the work. Right? Not every piece of work can have an authentic audience, but when you can do so, you'll capture much more student energy than you get when they're preparing for an exam. Getting them to be active. This is one of my favorite stories. Shada Jahanbani is one of our colleagues in history. She's a charming and brilliant young woman. And she was very taken with a book by Sam Weinberg called Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts. It's a cute title. It says simply, the way we think as academics, it's not typical. And if we want our students to think the way we do, think like an historian, that won't come to them easily. So her goal, she came to KU, she was going to teach this introductory history course. Her goal was to get them not to just recite the facts of American history or give the presidents an order or whatever the usual stuff was, but she wanted them to be able to look at a new artifact and be able to write about it the way an historian would. And so she taught her course that way, and as she put it, it took 2 bottles of wine to read those course evaluations. They sucked. They hated her, they hated the course. All right, she was distraught. But she got back up off the floor and said, well, how can I do this? I mean, and apparently one of the students said in an open-ended evaluation, you didn't give us the stuff. All right? So where's all the stuff of history, the events, the people, the story? So the next time she taught it, she gave the first 3 or 4 weeks of the semester to the students, put them in teams, gave them access to online resources, primed them with URLs they could start with, and had them construct all the stuff for the course. They built a timeline. They put in all the facts. They put in all the references. They built the story of history of the United States during that period. And then they spent the rest of the semester thinking like historians about their own stuff. They loved the course. They thought she was one. I mean, it was like 2 entirely different professors. What they wanted from her was a sense that they were getting some of what they expected. They didn't warm up to the thinking like an historian, but she appealed to their willingness to work in groups. She appealed to their being digitally comfortable. They didn't mind being sent off to the internet to find all this stuff. She responded well to their need to have the stuff, and they ended up responding to her intellectual goals. They were structured tasks. They were relevant to the grade. She gave them points for constructing the stuff. It was a socially constructed product with a near-term valued outcome. 3 weeks into the course, they already had a bunch of their grade determined. Flexible attention to multiple short activities. Not, trust me, if you keep thinking like an historian for a couple of months, it'll make sense to you. Connecting to personal experience. Here, this is my story. I teach a course called Conceptual Issues in Psychology. You know, it's a highfalutin course. I love it. I'm in the twilight years of my teaching. I get to teach what I want. It's a good thing. Free will and determinism, introspection, the mind-body problem. I mean, the big stuff, nature and nurture. It's great. It's actually modeled on the very first course I took in psychology. I did not take ever the traditional eye, ear, nose, and throat version of intro psychology. I had a specialized course taught by the department chair, and it was all about the big questions, and then he wove stuff about introductory psychology into it. So now I get to do something similar. The first day in class, literally, first day of class, you know, here's the syllabus and. I hand him a copy of this article from the New York Times. It's a simple story. Wendell Williamson killed 2 people on the Chapel Hill campus. A jury is awarded $500,000. He's awarded $500,000 from his psychiatrist. Okay, he claimed the murders would not have happened if Dr. Lipson had done his job properly. And the jury bought it. Okay.
Did he sue his mother too?
Huh?
Did he sue his mother too?
He could have. I think his mother was in on his side because the mother complained the psychiatrist didn't tell her how to give him the medications. Talk about enabling. So here's the article, and here are the discussion questions. Do you think Williamson should be in jail under criminal law? Why or why not? Under what conditions does our legal system conclude behavior should not be punished? What characteristics would you look for in behavior that's considered voluntary? The jury found against the psychiatrist. What is implied about the causes of his actions? Is the behavior seen to be created by Williamson? The first day of class, I do almost nothing. I put these questions up, I point to them, and then they argue with each other the whole time. All right? I'm getting, this is experience near. The second class, they read a chapter about a bunch of Mormons in the American Southwest who marry off Uncle Rouleau. The young girl there is married to the guy in the hat. He's also married to 2 of the other women, including this one. The chapter, written by John Krakauer, actually, the guy who writes about mountains and disasters, it's a terrific book, hangs on the question of whether a 13-year-old girl has the free judgment to decide to marry an old man who used to be married to her mother. The state of, I think it was Arizona, claimed she didn't and accused him of rape. The community says, well, she's old enough to become pregnant. She's an adult. She can decide for herself. And the students argue with each other. When do we believe that someone is free to make a decision of that consequence and free of the home environment enough to make an independent judgment?
I'm a little confused. So there's a classroom of 18-year-olds or 22-year-olds who are arguing about this important issue. Is there any science that leads to the answer, leads to the conclusion? In business school, we often reach conclusions that the smart thing to do is to issue debt or to incentivize your CEO. It's one thing to have a bunch of college students arguing with each other, but are they learning to reach the conclusions that?
At this is the second class. At this point, I have what I think is a correct conclusion, but I don't reveal that. What I want them to be doing is puzzling over the question of when do you decide that there is an sufficiently unconstrained act that you can label it as freely chosen. And then the next article they read, we finally get to some psychology. They read an article by a social psychologist who studies when people perceive people as brainwashed and when not. All right? And so we get to some science. He also ducks the question of whether is 13 too young or not. There are some 13-year-olds who probably make quite reasonable decisions, and there are some 30-year-olds who make terrible decisions. So the real issue is you shouldn't use age, but it's the only convenient and fair thing we have. What I'm trying to do is get them engaged enough that they will want to read. The next thing they do is they listen to a Martin Luther King speech. I originally started doing this in honor of King Day, but it turns out it's very powerful text. None of them have ever actually read this thing, and so they unpack his use of the word free. But then they get to this 1960 science piece. It's a debate between B.F. Skinner and Carl Rogers, where they do take on the serious evidence-based argument about whether or not people make free choices and when. A million years ago, when I first started teaching this course, this was the first thing they read. Now it's the last thing they read. And by the time they get to it, they're actually interested.
So this is what you meant earlier. You should start with the illustrations and end with the theory instead of.
Yeah. I start where they are. They're interested in that lurid story about the 13-year-old girl and Uncle Rulon. They're interested in the psychiatrist being, losing money to a murderer. That gets them thinking. That gets them puzzling over the question. And then I gradually reveal evidence from psychology. In this case, it's less evidence than argument, that I think speaks to the question. And I find they're willing to read this stuff because I've come at them through their own work. So here's a sort of a schematic of it. The examples of when we see this issue in play in ourselves eventually feeds into the discussion of theory and analysis, and then that feeds back. But by starting with Martin Luther King and the Mormons, I even have them, I've added in that they watched the play The Shape of Things, written by Neil LaBute, a KU graduate. It's about conformity among college students. This novel, they read a chapter about conformity in college students. And then, I don't know if you've seen this Errol Morris movie, The Standard Operating Procedure. It's his documentary in which he interviews all of the convicted soldiers from the Abu Ghraib prison, except the one who's still in jail, who was the ringleader. It's very powerful stuff. And again, I asked them to use the lenses of the things they've been reading. Can you make sense of whether or not those people made a free choice, given the context they were in? And they have to use, the judgment stuff from the social psychologists. They have to use the arguments Skinner and Rogers use. This is there's an article I actually handed a bunch of copies out today to some graduate students. The edubabble term for this is inductive teaching. Start from the particular cases, experience near, engage students, and work toward the high-level ideas. For most of my teaching career, I did it the other way around. So these inductive approaches, I ask them to workshop things. A lot of time in class, I'll have them cluster together with the people near them, get out their mobile devices and research something. Go find evidence or data on the topic we're talking about. The key thing is that they're motivated by personal interest, not pure discipline. They prefer immediately useful thinking, and they want to know how the ideas that I'm selling affect them. And then the last path I want to mention is a connection between the discipline and the community. This is a course by Ann Cudd. Some of you know her as she's a philosophy professor, now an associate dean in the college. She was teaching a course in feminist philosophy and was teaching it pretty abstractly. And then she took a seminar we ran in CTE on service learning. And she had her students working in community daycare and sheltered workshops for battered women, and writing about the feminist theory that she was having them read in class in the context of what they were observing with children and adult women. So instead of it's just being, I have to memorize what this philosopher said, they were being asked to connect the philosophical analysis with what they were seeing with their own eyes. They reported their observations and results. She had them use this sort of portfolio tool, so they made their work and their observations public in ways they could share with their family and friends, but it was also the deliverable in the course. And then another case is my dean, Danny Anderson, when he was still teaching in the Spanish and Portuguese department, also did service learning. He had students who were in a Spanish language and culture class become translators for Spanish-only speaking residents of Lawrence who were having trouble getting connected to the community. And in the process of doing their translation, he had these criteria for what he was looking for in their work. If you go into his portfolio, you can see the papers that they, especially if you read Spanish, and you get a sense of what a careful reader he was. Again, this work connects with student strengths because they care about ethics and justice. It's a personal motivation for them to be connected to an important issue in their community. The task is well structured. It has a near-term outcome. They accomplish something in the short term. And it's incredibly social. They're sharing it with peers. They're meeting new people. It is a human enterprise, not just an abstract incorporation of what are perfectly good ideas. So, there are distinctive qualities of our students. I like to think of them as assets as well as occasional liabilities, and some of them are true of me and my colleagues as well. Instruction begins near the experience of students and works toward my experience. And I design my assignments to match what I believe is already inside my students, and then guide them out to my world of ideas and abstract representations. And so my sort of summary point, maybe a little Pollyanna-ish, is this is a great time to be a teacher. Our young people aren't jaded, they're not stupid, they're not like us, but most of our colleagues in college weren't like us either. It's worth remembering. We can connect with their skills. The result will be a new source of energy, and that's the main thing that seems lacking. Is we're you know, people are kind of sleepwalking through college because there's no engagement, no way for them to really connect to work, and if we do that, they'll give us a lot more of what we want than we're getting now. So that's the pitch, based on my gathering together the perceptions of a number of our colleagues, and then figuring out how we turn that into ideas for instruction. Questions, comments, examples of your own, more challenges like the math challenge. It's a good one. It's a hard thing to do.
You had a lot of interesting examples, all from the college. Let me ask a couple of questions. We often think of ourselves as having mental models not unlike engineering, and so want some examples from the School of Engineering here at KU. But I'm also especially curious, are there business schools, we're doing a lot of benchmarking work right now, are there business schools in the country with which you're familiar that we should look to for innovations, applications of these modern ideas?
Let me think on that. I know there are. I'm not coming up with them off the top of my head. We have at least 4 or 5 portfolios on our site from faculty members in the School of Business. Some are kind of more routine, like using online quizzing to get people to do the reading. We did have one by Raquel Alexander on her work with accounting students, the stuff that the chancellor liked so much.
Service learning.
Yeah, that when the students were learning that tax can be used to help people, that motivated them to get better at doing tax. Trying to think, I don't think we have any of Douglas May's ethics work, not directly, but he was part of a project we did in teaching ethics in science and engineering. And he was very helpful in helping engineering faculty members think how to embed ethical principles into the content of their engineering course. But I can't recall if we have any of his work in particular in place.
How about the engineering school here? We are a step away, as Chris pointed out, we're a step away from the math department. We're not theorem proof, but a lot of what we do leads to specific learning outcomes, not unlike engineering. Are there folks there that are doing work that serve as role models?
Yeah. We have up work from the mechanical engineering department on their senior project. It has another possible connection with your work. They have the seniors work in teams on design projects. And then those projects are judged by their professional advisory board, people from engineering firms, who come in and give feedback on the quality of the student work, which is typically more severe than the feedback from the faculty, more critical. And they use that feedback both to help design the way they run the design seminar and the rest of the curriculum.
By the way, this is not unlike our applied portfolio management.
Yeah. Rick Hale has a portfolio. I mean, he's an aeronautical engineer. He does a lot of work, again, around design projects. Lisa Fries has a good one on, Rick's is about including writing in engineering, which is sort of, a lot of engineers don't think of that first. He views writing as critical to the engineering curriculum. And he and Lisa Fries both, do what the inductive crowd would call problem-based learning, what you would probably call case-based. They do a lot of that. Someone like Susan Williams, who's getting a lot of attention now because of her flipped course, is teaching a basic principles course. But when they get past that, they do a lot of problem-based engaged learning. So the students are given a design task and then have to go figure out what they need to know and then ask the instructor to help them learn it.
I don't dominate this, please. What's on your minds?
How dominating you are.
I understand.
It sounds like what you have as outcome is kind of anecdotal testimonials, student reactions and liking and so on. Do you have any other?
Sure. Our website has about 90 of these course portfolios, and your quite correct that they vary a great deal in how much I am able to get faculty members to give me what I would call evidence. Many of them do have evidence. There are people who will show you the data side by side from 2 semesters on how well students did when they changed this or that about their course. For some people, it's a one-shot only, and that you really can't, I mean, they'll show you the data from their semester, their exam-based data, Lisa Fries, for example, shows you her rubric for how she judged the ethics projects. We had an NSF grant to support that ethics project, and we analyzed student work from over 200 students, half of whom had an ethics taught by a philosopher or in a standalone course, and half of whom had this course-embedded, engaged ethics inside your content area. And we did reliable rating of the ethics understanding in those 2 approaches and present the data. I walk a fine line on that. I'm an experimental psychologist. Nothing that I see in this world would meet the standards of the journal I used to edit. Okay? If I don't get much response from colleagues saying, gee, how'd you like to try to redesign your course a little? I'd get a lot less if I said, and by the way, you have to do it to AERA standards so you can publish this. So I try to have a very open invitation. If you'll make your student work visible, you're in the club. If you want to do a real experiment, I'll show you how. There's a colleague in the psychology department whose portfolio documents changes she has made in a single course. Her name is Andrea Greenhoot. It's in child development. She stayed with a single assignment. Students were given the assignment of synthesizing the research findings in 3 journal articles, grown-up journal articles. And they had to write that knowledge integrated in everyday language as an advice column for parents. And her target was to get the synthesis, not just a book report, A found this, B found that, C, but really a synthesized piece of work. And when she started that in 1998, 2% of her students were capable of doing a decent synthesis. And she's been working on that every year since. And by 2009, she was up to 40% of the class, using the same rubric she was using for what constitutes good synthesis. And so she upped it. Now they have to read 4 articles. And in 2012, she was up to 60% of her class. Now, it's really not an experiment. It's an incremental, continuous quality improvement project. But when you look at her data and you see how she's persisted over time, and she documents each thing she did, it's as compelling as a real experiment. Maybe more so because she's replicating it. It doesn't ever disappear and fall back. Now, she's a rare bird. I'd be thrilled to have many more people like Dia around. So there are people doing that. She's actually, today in Boston, she and I have a grant from the Spencer Foundation, and she's presenting data we gathered and told me that it was really, really well received. So, I mean, Dan knows very well. Dan is one of my fine colleagues in the center, and it's a constant struggle to know how to approach our colleagues. As Ron knows, I don't want to steal time from people's research. I just want to say, the part you're doing is teaching. If you could do that more thoughtfully, let's ramp up what we mean by good teaching. And at a minimum, that means being public about what your students are doing, and then tracking it over time. So I encourage people to show the real stuff. But if I'm too tough about that, I get no colleagues who want to play.
Again, going back to what I said before me when Bill was talking about how, we have a lot of sort of very structured, building of theory-based tools.
Right.
Right? There's no let's discuss it, right? So you've got to, engineer, the bridge is going to stand or
Right.
the bridge is going to fall. And if you don't discuss how to build a bridge, you learn how to build a bridge, right? So I guess the question is, like, I can very easily see, I would call it doing kind of analogy-like activities and these sort of example-like activities in class live to get the students stimulating, but they still have to go through and systematically, after they get through that impressionistic moment about an idea or a concept, they still got to do the hard work of translating this into problem-solving tools and applying them.
I agree completely. If I had a lot of time,
And so my inclination is to say, well, I could spend more class time doing the fun stuff to motivate them. And then they'll go on and they do like online tutorials or something like that. But that's just like telling them to go read the book.
it is.
And if it's the one thing the students don't do, is they don't go read the book.
Yes, I agree.
They want me to come into class and spoon feed them.
Yeah,
They don't want to go read the book. So I guess the question is watching the online tutorial or something like that any different than telling them to go read the book?
No, I had several of my last graduate students did dissertations comparing online tutorials, reading books, and watching videos of great lectures. And time in and time out, we found that the best learning and the most efficient use of time was reading a book. And that if you have students who will seriously read text, you get great learning. I have students read. I give them points for doing the reading. I make them accountable for showing they've done the reading, and it benefits them. So I don't think there's anything magic about this. I like adaptive tutorials better than books because it's an interactive book. I don't know if you've seen any of the current version. I mean, the publishers have they call them adaptive tutorials, but they're pretty lame compared to the good work done at Carnegie Mellon. These are things where, as the student is reading, it's text, it has visuals, it has video, but it has self-checks where you're asked a set of questions, and depending on how you answer it, you get different feedback. And only when you're getting the reading do you move on to the next part of the reading. Textbooks don't do that typically. The publishers are trying to bring that out, but it's just a better book. And then it has high stakes checks. So I couldn't agree with you more. If you can get people to read, bingo. The thing I wanted to say earlier, though, is I got well known in certain circles for a study I did on my own tests. I, for years, gave essay exams on theory and conceptual analysis. And my colleagues, oh, these are great exams, they're really hard. And students were doing great. I had very high success rate with students writing these conceptual essays, right? And then a guy I met at the Carnegie Foundation sort of double dog dared me to change those into word problems. He says, write a problem that if they understand the theory, they can easily solve. And so one semester I did that. I changed all my exams to word problems. Grades went down 2 whole levels. Blew me away. All they were doing was copying my conceptual analysis. So I now write long word problems. I mean, half of a page is just the problem. And they can't study for it because there's nothing to memorize. Everything they need to know is in the question. But can they do this? I gave an exam back this morning. There were 4 people at 90 or above on the first try. A lot of people, 13 of the 40 were below 69. These are hard problems. And I agree with you, that's what they need to be doing. The discussion isn't the point. The discussion is intended to get them engaged enough that they'll do the hard work to be able to solve those problems. And I was very impressed with a book that I like called Teaching for Understanding. It came out of Howard Gardner's Project Zero in Boston. Gardner is a well-known educational psychologist. And they argue that there are 2 things that are important about deep learning. One is you don't have to rememorize it. Once you get it, you've got it. And second is you can use it in a way that you weren't taught, that it generalizes. It's called transfer, generalization, lots of different terms in Edubabble. And so that's what I teach for now, is the problem, the context that they see, they've never seen before. So after this free will and determinism stuff, we're talking about trials and, and Mormons and crazy people. One of the exam questions is, the government is considering privatizing Social Security. Under this plan, no one would be required to contribute as long as, analyze this from the point of view of free will and determinism. How would a libertarian analyze this policy? How would a determinist? Why would certain policies be appropriate to? That's the question. And I've never once mentioned Social Security in the whole class. That's a hard question. I mean, for the kids we have. That's what I'm teaching to. Now, I'm getting to it through all this discussion stuff because it's a lot, I'm trying to get them to come along with me on a pretty long ride. And they don't have any idea why they should care about policy. But to me, if they can't answer that question, they didn't understand the difference between a libertarian and a determinist. And so I'm with you 100%. We need to ask hard questions. And by the way, I believe there are right and wrong answers to that question. That's no, well, maybe whatever you said, it sounds fun. Not at all. I have a very strict rubric for that. But for me to get them to spend the time and energy it takes to be able to look at a problem they've never seen before on a topic they don't know well, but use the ideas they know well, it takes me a while to get them there. And so part of what I like about our portfolio system is I put those questions out for my colleagues to see. This is what my goal is. And I got N% of the class to do in this range on this question. And that's what I report, and that's what we argue about in the center. So I'm with you. I'm not trying to turn this into fun time.
No, I just wonder about the challenge because
It's a big challenge.
students everybody tells me the students, don't want to sit down and read the book with a pencil on the side.
Well,
Yet there's, at some point, there's no substitute for that. And
Absolutely.
Some of the time, there's no substitute for that.
And if I can say one more thing, I can read your body language. It's time for Friday afternoon. There's a wonderful article by two pretty famous educational psychologists, John Bransford and Dan Schwartz. It's called A Time for Telling. And it's a beautiful, empirically based defense of lecture. Right? Now, lecture is the whipping boy of all modern teaching. Terrible, never lecture. Okay. Their data show that a lecture is a great way to teach if the audience knows a lot about the subject and they have already tried to puzzle themselves about the problems being addressed in the lecture. Then they're interested, they follow it, it works great. Where a lecture is not so good is for first exposure, right? Then then what was that word? What did she say? They're just sort of bad scribes. And they're not thinking about it because they can't follow it. It takes all their attention just to know what's being said, much less to process it and question it and apply it as in real time. So, we spend a lot of time doing valuable class time, doing first exposure, passing on of information, instead of finding a way to give them, find contingencies or points or whatever to get them to read the book and write about it before they come to class. Then, if you wanted to lecture, you would be lecturing not about thus the content, you would be lecturing on problems you've given them to solve using what they read. And that would be good. But that's rarely done. In some way we have our curriculum upside down. We lecture to first year students and then don't lecture to the seniors who would get something out of it.
Dan, you'll be familiar with two of the three standards that we look for here in the business school. We aim to be on time. Well, I'm not a very good manager. We aim to be under budget, and you're free, and so I accomplished that one. The third thing we like to do is to be provoked, and this is, you have done exactly what we wanted to have happen. You've absolutely, every time I'm around you, you provoke my thoughts. And so this bag has some tokens from the business school. One is the standard coffee cup. Your office, you've got lots of coffee cups, but we want you to use this one because it has School of Business on it. And I want you to remember how much we appreciate your being with us this afternoon. Thanks a million.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it.